The mangy orphaned lion cub cries for help. What happens next is unbelievable. The sound cut through the morning stillness like a blade. High, desperate, and utterly wrong for this empty stretch of savannah. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stopped her field notes mid-sentence, her pen hovering over the datasheet as the cry came again, closer this time, carrying a raw vulnerability that made her chest tighten. In 15 years of wildlife research, she had learned to distinguish between the calls of distress and the calls of dying. This was something else entirely. Her research partner, James, had already moved toward the sound, his boots carefully avoiding the thorny scrub that dominated this section of the reserve. The terrain here was unforgiving, a maze of wait-a-bit thorns and scattered termite mounds that most animals avoided, making it an unlikely place to find anything larger than ground squirrels. Yet the cries persisted, growing weaker but more frequent, as if whatever was making them understood that time was running short. The cub emerged from beneath a cluster of fever trees like a ghost materialized from shadow. His golden coat was a patchwork of bare skin and matted fur, the telltale signs of advanced mange covering nearly half his small body. Open sores dotted his flanks, some fresh and weeping, others crusted over with dried blood and dirt. He couldn't have weighed more than 20 pounds, far too small to survive alone in territory where hyenas and leopards ruled the nights. Sarah felt her training take over, suppressing the immediate urge to approach. Lion cubs, even orphaned ones, retained wild instincts that could be dangerous when cornered. But this little one seemed beyond such considerations. His ribs showed clearly through his damaged coat, and his movements carried the unsteady weakness of prolonged starvation. When he looked up at the two humans, his eyes held neither fear nor aggression, only a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of weeks spent searching for a family that was no longer coming. The researchers exchanged glances, both recognizing the impossible situation. Adult lions had abandoned this sector of the reserve 3 months ago, following the great drought that had driven the herds eastward. No pride would venture this far into the wasteland to hunt, and certainly not to raise young. Yet here was evidence that at least one lioness had tried, had given birth in this harsh landscape and somehow lost her cub to circumstances they could only imagine. James slowly reached for the radio clipped to his belt, speaking in measured tones to the veterinary team back at the research station. The cub watched these movements with dull curiosity, too weak to flee even if escape had been possible. His breathing was shallow and rapid, each exhale visible in small puffs of vapor despite the growing warmth of the morning. Flies had begun to gather around his wounds, adding another layer of misery to his already desperate condition. "Easy there, little one," Sarah whispered, maintaining her distance while studying his posture and movement patterns. The cub's tail twitched at the sound of her voice, and he made a soft vocalization that seemed more like a question than a cry for help. His head tilted slightly, as if trying to process these strange creatures who stood quietly in his presence without showing dominance or threat. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the thornbush where a small lion had somehow survived the impossible, calling out across an empty landscape until someone finally heard his voice and chose to listen. The veterinary clinic at the research station had seen its share of wildlife emergencies, but the small enclosure in the corner seemed to hold more hope than usual. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah and James carried the cub back in a specially designed transport crate, and the transformation was already remarkable. Dr. Elena Vasquez made her morning rounds with the same quiet precision she brought to every patient, but her movements around this particular enclosure carried an extra measure of gentleness. The mange treatment had worked better than anyone dared expect. The cub's coat was growing back in patches of golden fur that caught the early sunlight streaming through the clinic windows. The open sores on his flanks had healed to pink scars that would fade with time, and his ribs no longer showed through his skin with such stark prominence. Most encouraging was his weight gain, nearly 8 pounds in 3 weeks, each ounce representing another step away from the brink of starvation. Sarah entered the enclosure with measured steps, carrying the morning feeding in a stainless steel bowl. The cub, who had been resting in the corner, immediately lifted his head and rose to his feet with fluid grace that hadn't been possible during those first desperate days. His approach was neither rushed nor hesitant, but carried the quiet confidence of an animal who had learned to associate human presence with comfort rather than threat. The feeding routine had evolved into something more complex than simple nutrition. The cub would eat a portion of his meal, then paused to look up at Sarah, making soft chuffing sounds that seemed almost conversational. She had learned to recognize these moments as requests for contact, and would gently stroke the growing fur on his head while he returned to his food. His purr, when it came, was barely audible but unmistakably present, a sound that wild lions rarely shared with humans. James arrived for his shift to find the cub waiting by the enclosure gate, not with the frantic energy of a caged animal, but with the patient expectation of one who had learned the rhythms of this new world. When the gate opened, the young lion stepped out with cautious dignity, his amber eyes scanning the clinic with alert curiosity. He had grown tall enough that his shoulders now reached James's knee, and his movements carried the first hints of the power he would one day possess. The daily enrichment walks had become exercises in trust building. The cub would follow James through the research station grounds, maintaining a distance of exactly 3 feet, as if an invisible leash connected them. When James stopped to check equipment or speak with other researchers, the cub would settle nearby, his gaze never leaving his human companion. Other staff members had noted this behavior with growing amazement. Wild cats, even hand-raised ones, rarely displayed such specific attachment to individual humans. "You're quite the shadow today," James murmured during one afternoon walk, as the cub matched his pace perfectly across the compound. The young lion's ears twitched at the sound, and he made a soft vocalization in response, a sound that seemed to bridge the gap between wild instinct and learned communication. By evening, when the cub returned to his enclosure for the night, he would position himself where he could see the main corridor through the mesh walls. Staff members working late shifts often reported seeing 2 amber eyes watching their movements, not with the desperate alertness of a frightened animal, but with the quiet attention of one who had found safety in the presence of others. The healing was progressing beyond the purely physical, creating bonds that challenged everything the researchers thought they understood about wild lions and human connection. The change began on a Tuesday morning in the 7th week of recovery. Sarah noticed it first during the routine health assessment, when the cub lifted his head toward the eastern hills and made a sound she had never heard from him before. It was deeper than his usual vocalizations, resonating from somewhere low in his chest, a rumbling call that seemed far too mature for his still-developing body. The sound carried across the research station grounds and faded into the acacia woodlands beyond, where the morning mist clung to distant ridgelines. Dr. Vasquez paused her examination, her stethoscope still pressed against the cub's flank as he repeated the call. This was not the high-pitched contact call typical of young lions separated from their mothers, nor was it the social chuffing he had learned to use with his human caregivers. The vocalization held a complexity that suggested genetic memory rather than learned behavior. Sounds that adult lions use to communicate across vast territories, calls that should have been beyond the knowledge of an orphaned cub. Over the following days, the pattern intensified. Each morning at dawn, the young lion would position himself at the highest point of his outdoor enclosure and direct these deep calls toward the eastern hills. His posture during these sessions was unmistakably purposeful, his head held high, ears forward, tail still. The calls would continue for 10 to 15 minutes, then cease entirely until the next morning. Staff members began to gather quietly during these sessions, drawn by the unusual behavior and the haunting quality of the sounds. James consulted behavioral literature and contacted colleagues at other research facilities, but found no documented cases of orphaned cubs displaying such sophisticated vocal patterns. The prevailing scientific understanding suggested that these complex territorial and contact calls were learned through extended interaction with adult pride members, knowledge this cub should never have acquired. Yet here he was, night after night, sending messages into the wilderness with the precision of an experienced adult. The response came on a Thursday evening, just as the research station was settling into its nighttime routine. A single, answering call drifted from the eastern hills, low and powerful, unmistakably made by a mature lioness. The cub, who had been resting quietly in his enclosure, immediately became alert, his entire body focusing toward the sound. He rose to his feet and answered with his own deep rumble, creating a conversation that spanned miles of wilderness. Sarah and James exchanged glances of disbelief as the calls continued back and forth across the darkening landscape. Through their binoculars, they could see a tawny figure moving along the ridgeline, a lone lioness, silhouetted against the evening sky, drawn by sounds that should have meant nothing to her. She approached slowly over the following hours, pausing frequently to call and listen for responses. By dawn, she stood at the outer perimeter of the research station, separated from the cub by only a few hundred meters of fencing and the careful protocols of wildlife management. Her amber eyes held the same quiet intelligence they had seen in the cub, and when she called to him, he answered with a sound that carried recognition across the space between captivity and freedom. "Listen to that," James whispered, as the morning light revealed the lioness settling into the grass, her gaze never leaving the enclosure where an impossible reunion was about to unfold.